insecure deserialization? Insecure deserialization vulnerability is also can be called as untrusted deserialization. And it's actually a very critical vulnerability. It's part of OWASP top 10. And how does that happen? So it can affect the applications which actually serialize the data, and the deserialization happens on them. So to understand this particular risk, if we talk about the new systems, or the systems that we have now, which are highly complicated, distributed, we have components everywhere, and all those components talk to each other and share some kind of data or information with each other. The serialization, if I talk about, it's the process of turning the binary data into a string or ASCII character so that it can be moved using the standard protocols. So serialization operations are extremely common in the microservices or APIs. Now, when we do serialization, then there could be deserialization as well. So using this insecure deserialization, attacker can fetch some data from the server. Like when the input can be modified by the user, the result is an untrusted deserialization vulnerability. So in this case, if I talk about like we send some, there is some data on the server side, and we try and fetch that data, and we are able to do it. So any serialized data used by an application is at risk of manipulation. Like any malicious user can manipulate. So ideally, it should be accompanied by some integrity checks, so that it can avoid all these deserialization vulnerabilities. So this deserialization can happen in Java library, and where not, which can be a big concern. um, so let's talk more about it. So application deserialize data from untrusted sources, and that can affect them, like such as parsing a YAML file or straight out loading the serialized objects. It can also enable remote code execution, and it is very relevant issue when we talk about microservices, APIs, and the new architecture that we have, because they serialize the data. So how, what we can do is, we can understand the data serialization formats like JSON, XML, YAML, and they often require external inputs, which is like the most common thing. And such software needs to be kept up to date. We've seen that if you're using a old libraries, that can lead to so many bigger mistakes. And here, if we don't recognize them on time, it can give attacker a lot of information using remote code execution. Here, how would you get to know that if your application is vulnerable? Because that's again the question that comes into picture. So applications and application APIs which are vulnerable, if they deserialize the tempered objects, or they can take inputs from a user and just go ahead and start using it. Another thing, if I talk about that, serialization may be used in applications for uh, remote and inter-process communication, caching, database servers or cache servers or file systems. It can also be used for cookies, for HTML form parameters or API token. Um Now, when this serialization is so critical, why are we still using it? And if I have to talk more about it, in order to understand that, first we'll have to get to the basics of serialization. Like I talked about that, why do these protocols or processes support these serialization or deserialization vulnerabilities? So here, one thing, remember that many programming languages offer this ability to customize the deserialization process. And if nothing should happen, if an attacker gets to know that yes, there is a deserialization that can be done, it can harm the application to a greater extent. Now there can be another question, that how can deserialization be insecure? Because it's the function of it. So if the function that is responsible for converting the serial data, like you're stacking it, you are serializing it into a structured object, and assume that data is trusted. Like anything that I'm giving, it thinks that it's trusted. So if I'm attacker, I may leverage the format and deserialize the content. Unfortunately, many such deserialization functions and programming language assume that the data is safe. And there have been so many cases where are so many vulnerabilities which exist in different functions. More about what are the defenses of insecure deserialization. Here, we need to make sure when we deserialize any data should always raise an alarm if it thinks that there is a malicious person who's taking the data. And data coming from external sources should always receive special care. There has to be proper validation into it. Script, if there is anything that is potentially look unsafe, that has to be vetted properly. And especially if I talk about the architecture patterns, it should not accept the serialized objects from untrusted sources. We need to have strict strict constraints against any external inputs. We need to isolate the running code that deserialize the data in the low privilege environment. We've been talking about we need to have proper privileges.